Thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. A little bit of biography. I am by training an architect, and over the last few years I've developed a sort of split career where I often work in practice, I teach as well, but I also write about architecture a lot, both in journalism. I write for lots of magazines and newspapers and so on in the UK, but also writing books of what I would say is probably cultural history through architecture. And the most recent one, which was published at the start of this year on Verso, is called Last Futures. And if there's an elevator pitch, as they call it, where you bring it down to a very short description. One way to describe it is it's posing a question. Well, it's posing a number of questions, but the best way I think I can put it is. So yeah, how did architecture stop being seen as a vehicle for social change? Another way to put that is what did the future look like before the future was cancelled? So on a kind of basic level, the book is a look at the last time that architecture was part of a period of very quick social, technical and political change, which I would argue is from the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Now, the subtitle to the book, which opens it up a bit further, is it's Nature, Technology and the End of Architecture. And to briefly explain what I mean by that, with nature, this image, Earth Week, was 1970, I believe, or where this particular image comes from. So at the time, there's effectively a new understanding of nature is coming into being in general consciousness. Environmentalism pops up in this period and rises to a peak that it fell back from and hasn't reached until the present day again. Nature in this period, rather than either raw material to be worked with or the kind of overwhelming sublime romantic force, there's an idea that comes up in this period where nature is beginning to be seen as a kind of fragile, interconnected web of systems, and in particular that human activity is throwing way out of equilibrium, and architecture has to respond to that in this time. Technology, well, of course, there was a lot going on in this period. I'm interested in the way that establishments looked at this technical change and how architects looked at this technical change, and just how generally people involved in creating space looked at the kind of rise of automation and its implications for free time, leisure and things like that. Man and machine, the question of cybernetics, artificial intelligence and things like that. Again, the point being that there's some ripe connections between then and now in terms of how people are worrying about the relationship of labour to technique. And then the end of architecture is that in this time there are these various advances that are being made, social, political, technical. They suggested developments into the future, and this was a period that there was a lot of speculation right across the world, more so in some places than others, but it was a fairly universal thing. And the basic conditions of architecture were questioned in a way that hasn't been done in quite the same way since. And the question of how all-encompassing architecture could be, and thus at what point does it disappear as a medium, that became quite a serious question in this period. So I think one thing that's clear is that what drew me into this work was a way of writing about some of the problems of today by writing about a period where they were these questions were being asked previously. So the thing is, it's not happening in isolation. There's a lot of stuff that's going on rhetorically in the culture at the moment. There are various things that I'm absolutely not doing, or trying not to do, one of which is what you might call jetpack nostalgia, which is that view of the futurism of that period in terms of its kind of almost patronizing look at the past and the silly ideas that they had about what was coming next. The internet has been pretty bad for this. There's all these millions of articles about, 10 amazing future cities that were never built and all this kind of stuff. This is not what we're looking at. Brutalist nostalgia, which is big in the UK at the moment. On the left there, I'm not sure where Zupa Graphica are from actually, but there is a brutalism in the culture in London has become, and in the UK has become quite a big deal. It's still hated by most people, but there is a really kind of inane, clickbaity passion for concrete buildings at the moment. And of course, you'll recognise the kind of patronising fascination with, say, partisan memorials and so on that happens on the internet. This is ahistorical and not deep enough analysis to get involved in. Whimsy. I don't think we should be interested in things that were just wild speculations. I think what's interesting about the period I'm talking about is the fact that people believed things were coming and they didn't come, and what's going on there. So a thing like the Walking City, the famous Archigram project, it's meaningless, effectively. However, there were speculations at the time that were much more significant, and I think we need to look again at those. What we've got here is what happened was that after the 70s and postmodernism and so on, the disconnection between what was considered radical practice and what was actually happening became huge. So these are contemporary. On the right is Zaha Hadid. On the left, that's Prince Charles's village of Poundbury, which these works are contemporary of each other. What's telling about the 60s and 70s is just how close to the building of cities the radical ideas were, or vice versa, basically. Even reactionary establishments were very, very ambitious then, and there are various reasons for that. I mean, everyone's been through most people have been through the Second World War and so on, and there's a sense that change is happening much more quickly. Today's attitude to this kind of thinking is that it's arrogant, it's aloof, it all failed, blah blah blah. But I would put that in under what we call the TINA doctrine, the there is no alternative doctrine. I would like to point out that there is an alternative. So some of the things that are going on, the next few slides are just themes that architects are responding to. This is clearly the era of big technology in a way that we do recognise now, but back then, the size and scale of the most advanced tech was remarkable at that point. but it's also the dawn of small technology as well. So miniaturization kicks off in earnest in this period as well. So architecture is very influenced by the aesthetics of the space race and things like that, and the kind of technocratic vision of things. But at the same time, the improvement in electronics at that point reduces in size and threatens to kind of completely remove architecture as a meaningful technical discipline. But you don't need me to tell you that while there was great optimism about technology in this period, then it's also a period of great fear and so on. Now, to go on, I've got a selection of projects effectively that exemplify what I'm talking about the architecture of this period. Some of it, I was looking at the list, and some of it's quite there's quite a lot of them are British projects, but I think that it's quite easy to see the themes that are happening right across the world, not just in the West as well, at this point. But one of the favourite ones that I like to talk about is a project in Scotland, which is called Cumbernauld Town Centre. Now, it's still there, and it frequently gets awarded prizes for being the ugliest building in the whole of the UK, for being the worst architecture there's ever been, and so on. It doesn't help that it's on the top of a windy hill in wet Scotland, and so it doesn't look as nice and white as there. But I'm putting it up there is to show that there was is to sort of demonstrate that at this time there was an ambition to create very large, singular complexes to bring all the functions of the city into single buildings. Time and again, in writing at the time, you spot people talking about the increased social complexity of the times, and what you find is that people who are commissioning buildings are frequently seeking to commission buildings with increased programmatic complexity. So this building is part of a new town. The UK built 20 odd new towns from the 50s through to the 80s even. And in this building, you can see the market for the new town. You can see the UK's first indoor shopping centre for the new town. You can see a transport interchange. You can see public libraries and civic functions, the offices for the local council. There's hotels there. There's even housing. The bar that runs across the top is housing. So this is a great example, and this was world famous at the time for being this new kind of mega-structural idea of bringing everything together. This kind of thinking you see a lot in the new universities, not just the UK had a very interesting building boom in the 60s of new radical universities, but it happened elsewhere as well. And here, again, buildings are being seen almost as systems in a new way. These are kind of semi-electronic, semi-organic are the metaphors that people are using. They are entwined with the landscape. They are growing out of the ground, but they're also like crystalline. They're molecules, and they're also like data points and so on. So there's this kind of metaphor of social and technical complexity being expressed in architecture through open-ended designs. Here's a North American example from around the same period of this overlapping of anti-monumental overlapping of varieties of different functions and so on, and very very technocratic, systemic kind of design. It's also a period where that's odd. That's better. It's also a period where system thinking comes into construction in a big way. across the world, it's panel time, it's prefabrication time. Nearly every country has its own names for that kind of building, and it worked better in some places than others. The UK is interesting in this regard because it adopted panel construction very, very heavily, very quickly, and not from necessarily a left-wing perspective. It was largely a kind of conservative cost-cutting measure, but the UK adopted panel construction very, very heavily. So this estate, for example, is apparently is the largest, or at one point it's half demolished now, but apparently at one point this was the largest single estate in at least Western Europe. And what happened with this stuff is that it was built extremely quickly, and in the UK in particular, but in other places as well, its social and political decline was very rapid. And it's a very interesting historical story to see how public opinion was initially super enthusiastic, elite opinion was super enthusiastic, and then to watch as these attitudes towards high technology, overwhelmingly planned estates, how that turned sour is a fascinating story. Of course, it has links to things like, or works like Jane Jacobs in the US and so on, but it's also partly a turn against central planning, the rise of neoliberal thinking and so on. So by the time many of these estates are fully occupied, no one wants to know. And in the UK's case, and in many other cases, they were also built very, very badly, and often. And the failures, the technical failures, are then compounded by what are seen to be social and ideological failures, and discredits for a generation this ambitious technocratic idea of designing. Other things that are happening at this point. There's the ideal of the three-dimensional city, which rises up. Again, this is somewhere where, I mean, generally speaking, the UK is extremely backward when it comes to architecture. It has been since the medieval period, but every now and then it produces a lot of kind of forward thinking. And the UK in the early 60s was very much exporting ideas to the world. And so in a government report about the problem of what will happen when everyone owns a car, and like in America, our cities will collapse. The report, which was published as Traffic in Towns, argued for the three-dimensional city, the complete segregation of pedestrians and vehicles. And then this is massively inspirational across the world and becomes one of the main characteristics of urbanism of that period, which is famously deployed in the Park Hill flats, which again were influential across the world with the famous streets in the sky. This is an extremely kind of adventurous and modern and future-looking, I suppose, way of thinking about the city. And again, like I was saying, it's at first received extremely well, but as the 70s go on, it becomes a stick with which modern urbanism is attacked with. And they, again, through Jacobs, through other writers and so on, to the point where instead of being recreations of working class communities, this kind of urbanism becomes a kind of alienating, almost incitement to criminality. But these kind of ideas of urbanism do have exemplars as well at the time. There are certain cases where it creates something where historic forms are reinterpreted with kind of contemporary techniques and standards, and some kind of odd synthesis of traditional housing types with the best that modern technology has to offer do occasionally occur and are very successful. But there were even more radical ideas about how to change housing and dwelling at that period that are worth touching on. One of the famous examples, this is Expo 67, this is Moshe Safdie. Again, what's happening here is these are attempts to reconcile modern construction and modern design with, let's say, taking ingredients from the best of traditional communities. Now, Safdie at the time talked about Arab villages, he talked about kibbutzes, he talked about suburbia and high-density modern housing, and he said, I have done all of them in this, which is extremely ambitious. And whether you agree or, I mean, his career certainly doesn't, his later career certainly doesn't bear this out, but this is a truly wonderful exemplar project. People are beginning to, there's the new materials of plastics and generally ephemerality in consumer capitalism are inspiring people at this point to try and work out ways of making the city more ephemeral, and this is where it starts getting more extreme. But it's important to note that how seriously people took these ideas at the time. So temporariness in construction was a big talking point. I showed you the walking city earlier on by Archigram. This is the plug-in city. And I mean, I don't think Archigram are very good in general. I think they've had I think Peter Cook has had a terrible influence on architecture in general. But this is an interesting project, I claim, because what this shows is what was actually being done at the time hypothetically extended a few years into the future. So where we had the panels being lifted into place and then becoming permanent flats, here the idea as well, the flats are pre-assembled and they're moved around and then maybe you'll move them again. It might look wild, but if you actually, I mean, if you were to cover up half of that from the top up and make it just 8 stories, it would not actually be that far off what was housing practice in many parts of the world at that point. But the idea is, you know, people are no longer tied down to their individual locations. They can trade up their house as if it was a caravan or a washing machine is another good example of what people were thinking about at the time. And this notion of, I mean, the car industry was what everyone was looking at as well at the time. They were like, these millions and millions of cars are coming off production lines, being built by, you know, robot labor and so on. Why can't this happen in architecture? Now, on the one hand, that's a kind of inane question coming from nowhere. But there were interesting ideas being toyed with and attempted about indeterminacy, replaceability, and in the kind of mega-structural period where the idea was that, as you see here, and as you see in the roof there, that large-scale frames would be built into which the populace would be able to move their housing, dwelling, business at will. And there's a kind of idea happening there about a role for the state in the production of space. The state provides the infrastructure and the kind of guarantee of spatial regularity, as it were, and then people become free to move around within that. This kind of thinking appears again back in the universities, in the famous Free University, and again it starts to have the quality of circuit diagrams. This is literally a university competition from the period based on a kind of diagram of a circuit board, because this is the kind of knowledge of the future that they're thinking about. And in the famous Cedric Price project, the university itself effectively disappears, and it becomes a kind of institution held in movable sheds and so on. This betrays the influence of, as we saw earlier in one of the early images, cybernetics, the idea of the reconciliation of mind and body, of the man and machine, and so on. Cybernetics, well, there's a whole industry of looking at cybernetics and so on, but how it applied to architecture was the idea that things would be reconfigurable from day to day, that in response to user habits, user behavior, the buildings might change, and that you would have a democratic form of city, or a more democratic form of city, where the individual within society would have a greater sense of freedom. Whether that's true freedom or not is another question. But what a project like this also connects to is the question of free time as well. And a lot of the discussions that you read in, say, popular science or in current affairs magazines and things like that, or in architecture, is what is the populace going to do with all the free time that it's going to have in the future? And so leisure architecture becomes a big question. And you get these experimental projects, which now look quite quaint, but you get these projects of massive interiors where entertainment can happen, and the inside it expands further. The one on the left there, that was literally, it was built in that the Isle of Man sits between the UK and Ireland, and it was built to stop people going to Spain on holiday because flights were cheaper. So it was an attempt to create a kind of working class holiday resort inside a box, a big glass box. It's famous in the UK because there was a fire disaster there, where the whole thing went on fire very, very quickly, and I think 50 people died, and so it's burned into the kind of history of modern architecture as a terrible example of ambitious new technology causing horror. On the right, no, the one on the right is still there actually, and is famous because it has a wave machine where 10,000 people are all in the pool at one point. But it's easy to overlook how futuristic that was at one point. Now, these are celebrated kind of artistic connections, but this notion of the expanded interior catches the mind of radicals, and on both utopian and dystopian levels. This ability to create kind of huge abstract internal environments leads to be, I mean, in Constant's case, it's ambiguous, but the idea is, nomadic life can course through the city once all the kind of permanent functions are liberated. A similar idea appears in Friedman. Archism, being North Italians, being connected to autonomy and all that, they've got the opposite idea. They think this is the end of the world, basically. The leisure interior being the end of class struggle, basically, because people are completely sated by this kind of entertainment landscape that they end up living in. Interestingly, this is a beautiful image, but it is effectively how a lot of how much of our architecture is built today. I mean, if you're ever in an office or an airport or anything like that, this is effectively the kind of environment that you're moving through. But at the time, this was seen as, what is happening? So obviously at this point, you've got the counterculture is happening at this point. And there's all kinds of, so while there is a great optimism and great ambition about changing things, there's also like all manner of naysaying and doomsaying. Marcuse and so on. Socially, modern consumer capitalism is making you dead inside. Is a horror. Technological change is a horror. People can't cope. Alvin Toffler died a few weeks ago. Interestingly, in that book, I don't know if anyone's read it, but it has a lot about architecture in it, which is quite interesting. And he argues that the kind of temporary architecture of people like Archigram or Buckminster Fuller is equivalent to a throwaway biro pen. It's wasteful and is a symbol of an ephemeral, panicked society. Population bomb. This is the era of kind of apocalyptic bestsellers, all the way to the limits to growth. If no one's read that, it's an incredible period piece. It's really something else. It's well worth a read. So this is the period where the global consciousness is happening. 68, they bring the picture of the whole Earth back. You have the whole counterculture, which is obsessed with architecture as well, obsessed with famously the dome. So while you have this kind of high-tech people coming out, I mean, Buckminster Fuller is the great example here, of course, because he works for the military one week, then the next week he's kind of hanging out with naked hippies out in the Midwest and so on, and he straddles all these worlds. But it is fascinating to look at this stuff and see how removing yourself from consumer society was also seen as connecting yourself to new network society as well. And of course this has huge ramifications for the people who are becoming ever more powerful now. The geodesic dome, it's a new age thing, but it's also a technocratic thing. It becomes a symbol for so many things at once. It's the ingenuity of American scientific knowledge. It's the pioneer spirit. It's oneness. It's earthliness. It's it's even the embryo, and it's the cell, and it's the cosmos. It means all of these things to people at various times. Peter Sloterdijk, his whole kind of theoretical structure is based on the kind of the spherical volume, and that has a lot of relevance to this kind of period. So while you have, your 1970s pot plants, timber, free love, counterculture stuff, at the same time this is happening. It's the same idea effectively appearing in different locations. This is I don't think you have that anything like that since. The gap between elite establishment thinking in terms of the production of space and the more radical fringes has never been quite as tight as that, I don't think. And another celebrated image, but here, the idea of the question of dwelling. The dome raises questions about dwelling and what is the kind of the minimum existential bubble that you require to survive and so on. All of this is being asked at the time, from the tiniest scale of the individual to the massive scale. I mean, this is a kind of Ayn Randian kind of image in a way, but this is a fascinating study that was done in 1970 where one of the German chemical companies that had changed its name after the war for obvious reasons was looking to see if it would make sense to open up, whether it's oil fields or diamond mines or what have you, in hospitable environments. And so they get these architects and engineers together to come up with what they would do. And the idea is that they'd have a kind of plastic dome that would cover a city of 30,000 people. But they work it out as if it's just a design problem and they're going to be building it in 5 years' time. There's no question that like this is outlandish or completely impossible. This is people did think that they were going to do that. Fry Otto, he died a couple of years ago, but in interviews in the last few years of his life, when he's asked about these kind of things, he says, yeah, obviously none of that works. You know, obviously we were stupid at the time. But I mean, that's a disavowal coming from a very changed kind of ideological context. And, you know, this is a very, very popular image on the internet, but I think, I mean, the space colonies is what became the space shuttle instead. So NASA decided to spend their money on the space shuttle rather than even thinking about trying to develop this. But for a while they were really toying with it. And it's interesting because it takes these ideas of bubbles and domes and so on and takes them onto a kind of massive scale. And yet, when they depict it, what have we got? But we've got the kind of modernist concrete panel housing being built inside these space colonies. You know, it's the ideas are all wafting around at the same time. So, if this is what the context was like, what goes wrong? Well, like lots of things go wrong. You know, the oil crisis of '73. And on all the kind of economic travails that follow, that's a huge influence on putting the brakes on futuristic speculation. The stagnation in the USSR across the 70s is comparable, of course. There's a right-wing reaction against modernism that really gains pace in the 1970s. Modernism is effectively equated with socialist planning, with the limits to personal freedom and so on. Very effectively, these arguments work really well, and people come to associate that kind of architecture with that kind of world. Neoliberalism and ideas about who has the right to create space. You know, it's the developer. It's free enterprise. It's not the state. History returns to architecture. Postmodernism comes back, and with postmodernism comes with the rise of postmodernism comes the abandonment of the belief that human society could change. 10 years before, everyone believes that it is changing so fast that we have to keep up and we need to think big because we'll never be able to keep up. 10 years later, people are always the same. Just what was good for them 500 years ago is fine now. And that kind of stasis, I mean, it's been written about 1 million times, but that kind of sense of social stasis is something that is gradually unraveling these days. What was at stake? This jumps back in time here, but the relationship to nature, I think, is very important at this period. As I touched upon, in this era that I'm talking about, nature really became something that could be ruined and destroyed, and architecture responded to that in a kind of weird technical way in places, drawing on the legacy, the kind of romantic technical legacy of the winter gardens of the 19th century, and you ended up with something like Biosphere 2, which was the kind of attempt to build an ark where humans could live in harmony with nature, except the humans couldn't live in harmony with each other, of course. And these are fundamentally architectural questions about how we how we live together and how we live on the planet and so on. So just to cap off, the kind of resonances that I started thinking about when I was writing this, technology, the question of automation, the automation wave of that period, it moved people into service jobs, effectively. But now the big question is, the second wave, this new wave of automation, like, what will people do? Which is why you hear so much about things like universal basic income and questions about this, because there is a distinct possibility that, many, if not most jobs will be automated. Housing, I think across the board at that period, nearly everyone was trying to solve their housing crisis in terms of states. Whereas in many parts of the world now, governments are merely just trying to prolong their housing crisis for as long as they can keep it going, because it benefits the people from whom they get their legitimacy. Completely different way of looking at housing now. And then environmentalism. It may have been a bit of a fringe pursuit back then, but the parallels between the attempts that were made to understand urbanism in a finite ecological sense, and then what we now know is very telling and kind of terrifying, of course. But that is what it is. But what's happened since I started writing is this kind of thing has popped up. And this is still ongoing, I think. I don't know if they've given up yet, but this is Google's idea for its campus in California, with every idea from the 60s just kind of rehashed, or 60s and 70s. So movable buildings within a massive internal environment, nature and technology coexisting, biomimesis in the built environment. All of these ideas, bang, bang, bang. Here they come again. Amazon building geodesic domes for its headquarters, Elon Musk and SpaceX, a total 70s throwback if ever there was one. All of this is suddenly, this rhetoric is kind of reappearing. And of course, the tech industry thinks of itself as the kind of inheritor of the countercultural utopian rhetoric, but that's extremely problematic thing to say. And I think that we're going to see more of this kind of thinking reappearing or resurfacing. And I think it would be very bad if we forgot, or if it was neglected, the genuinely progressive, genuinely utopian moments that were occurring at that point, whether they were from radicals outside of society or even progressive elites within society and so on. I do think that this is very much the kind of thing that we should be looking at historically right now, basically. And that's me.